In the dim glow of dusk, young Ethan Bell gripped his worn blue jacket tighter as he entered Crestwood Academy for the fourth time this month. The well-worn material was a relic from simpler days, a reminder of past schools and towns now lost to memory. His family's constant relocations due to his mom's nursing career meant Ethan had learned to blend into the background, to become a ghost in new hallways. At 16, he was slender and quick, with a mop of sandy hair and eyes that darted around, always watchful. The corridors of Crestwood throbbed with the usual teenage chaos as kids rushed to class, gossiping and laughing. Ethan navigated the throng with practiced ease, his head down and his bag clutched close. He'd already mapped out the school, finding quiet corners in the library where he could lose himself in books and avoid unwanted attention. "Well, look what just crawled out of the woodwork," a voice sneered from behind him as he neared his locker. Ethan didn't need to turn around. He recognized the tone from Northwood High and Pinewood Prep. It was the sound of trouble finding him again. The voice belonged to Damian Blackwood, a burly senior with slicked back hair and a sneer that never seemed to leave his face. Damian was always accompanied by his cronies, Kyle Peterson, tall and thin with a cruel smirk, and Rick Olson, shorter but with bulging muscles and fists that looked like they'd broken a few noses. They were the self-proclaimed rulers of Crestwood, mistaking fear for respect, using their size and arrogance to dominate the school. "New kid thinks he's too important to greet us," Damian drawled, stepping closer until Ethan could smell the cheap cologne he wore. "That's not very polite, is it, boys?" Ethan focused on his locker, his fingers steady despite the tension that coiled in his stomach. He'd faced this before. The trick was to give them nothing, no reaction, no fear, and especially no reason to escalate. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly guess, was that Ethan had spent the last 3 years learning self-defense techniques from his grandfather, a retired Marine. His grandfather had taught him how to use his size to his advantage, how to turn an opponent's strength against them. "I'm talking to you, Blue Jacket," Damian snarled, shoving Ethan hard against the metal locker. The clang echoed down the hallway, causing a few students to glance over before quickly turning away. Nobody wanted to get involved with Damian's gang. Ethan straightened slowly, his hand still on the locker door. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Just getting my stuff." Kyle cackled, a grating sound that cut through the noise. "Hear that, guys? Just getting my stuff," he mimicked in a mocking tone. "What are you, a baby?" Rick moved in on Ethan's other side, effectively trapping him against the lockers. "We heard you're from Seattle," he said, cracking his knuckles menacingly. "Big city boy, huh? This is a small town, and we run things here. Got it?" Ethan nodded, keeping his eyes down. Inside, he felt his pulse slowing, his breathing becoming more even. These were the physical responses his grandfather had taught him, but he suppressed them. Fighting here would mean questions, suspensions, and maybe worse. It would mean his mom finding out about his grandfather's lessons, something he'd kept secret. "Good," Damian said, slapping Ethan's cheek in a demeaning gesture. "Here's how it's going to work. Every day you're going to give us whatever money you have on you. Call it a protection fee, and on Tuesdays, you're going to do our chores for us. Rake leaves, shovel snow, whatever we need, understand?" Before Ethan could answer, the first bell rang, and the hallway began to clear as students hurried to class. Damian's crew stepped back, but the message was clear. This was only the beginning. The rest of the morning was a blur of introductions and awkward participation in classes, where Ethan tried to disappear into the crowd. At lunch, he found an empty bench near the football field, pulling out a sandwich his mum had made and a battered copy of a science fiction novel. He'd found that reading made him seem busy and unapproachable, though it rarely worked for long. "Well, well, well," Kyle's voice interrupted his reading. "If it isn't our new best pal." Ethan looked up to see the three of them approaching, carrying lunch trays and wearing identical smirks that spelled trouble. The field was full of students, but Ethan could already see them looking away, pretending not to notice what was about to happen. "Mind if we join you?" Damien asked, not waiting for an answer before plopping down on the bench across from Ethan. Kyle and Rick flanked him on either side, their presence making the small space feel cramped and threatening. "Actually," Ethan began, starting to rise. "Sit down," Rick snapped, his hand slamming down on Ethan's shoulder, forcing him back onto the bench. "We're not done talking." Damien reached across the bench and snatched Ethan's sandwich, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Peanut butter and jelly," he announced to his friends. "How original. I was getting tired of the cafeteria garbage anyway." He took a huge bite, chewing slowly while staring directly at Ethan. Crumbs fell onto the bench, and Damien made no attempt to brush them off. It was a deliberate act of disrespect, meant to establish dominance. "You know what I think?" Kyle said, leaning back and grinning. "I think our friend here needs to learn his place. This isn't Seattle, kid. You can't just waltz into our school and expect to be treated like you belong." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. His grandfather had taught him to assess his opponents, to understand their motives and weaknesses. Damien was the classic alpha bully, craving constant validation. Kyle was the instigator, pushing situations toward conflict. Rick was the muscle, the enforcer who carried out the threats. They operated as a unit, feeding off each other's energy. "Look," Ethan said carefully, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get through school." "Trouble?" Damien scoffed, devouring Ethan's sandwich and wiping his hands on Ethan's sleeve. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly, right, boys?" He nodded to Rick, who immediately reached over and swatted Ethan's book onto the grass. The book landed with a thud, pages scattering. "Oops," Rick said with fake sincerity. "My bad." Ethan started to get up to retrieve his book, but Kyle's foot shot out, blocking his way. "Where do you think you're going, Blue Jacket? Lunch isn't over yet." The nickname stung more than Ethan wanted to admit. His grandfather had instilled in him a sense of self-respect, a belief in his own worth. But here he was just Blue Jacket, a target to be bullied without consequence. "Please," Ethan said, his voice quiet but with a hint of steel. "Just let me get my book." Damien leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Say please, sir," he demanded. "Show some respect." The field seemed to quiet down, other students sensing the tension but unwilling to intervene. Ethan could see a few teachers in the distance, but they were deep in conversation and oblivious to the scene unfolding on the bench. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, focusing his mind the way his grandfather had taught him. In the Marine Corps, there was a code of honor, a respect for discipline and courage. What was happening here was different. It was petty cruelty meant to erode his self-esteem. It was the kind of psychological warfare that could break someone who didn't know how to defend themselves. But Ethan did know how to defend himself. He just couldn't use those skills. "Please, sir," he said finally, the words tasting like dirt in his mouth. "Let me get my book." Damien's smirk widened. "That's better. See, boys? He can learn." He nodded to Kyle, who moved his foot. Ethan quickly grabbed his book, checking the pages for damage as he sat back down. The cover was scuffed, but it was still readable. "Same time tomorrow, Blue Jacket," Damien said as the three of them stood up. "And don't forget about our little agreement. We'll be expecting that protection fee." They walked away, laughing, leaving Ethan alone on the bench with the remnants of his lunch scattered around him. He sat there for a long time, staring at the crumbs, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes that had watched him be humiliated. The afternoon classes crawled by, Ethan unable to concentrate on anything but the encounter on the field. He'd dealt with bullies before, but never with such a calculated approach. Damien's crew wasn't just looking for a quick thrill, they were establishing a long-term dominance that would keep Ethan under their thumb for the rest of the year. As the final bell rang, Ethan gathered his books and headed for his locker, hoping to avoid another confrontation. But as he turned the corner, he saw them waiting for him. Damien was leaning against the lockers, arms crossed, while Kyle and Rick blocked the exit doors. They'd positioned themselves perfectly to intercept him no matter which way he turned. "Time to pay up, Blue Jacket," Damien called out as Ethan approached. The hallway was emptying quickly as students rushed to catch buses, leaving Ethan with few potential witnesses. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $2 bill, his bus fare for the next day. He held it out without making eye contact, hoping the transaction would be quick and painless. Damien snatched the money and examined it with exaggerated disappointment. $2, that's it? Come on, Seattle. I know you've got more than this. "That's all I have," Ethan said truthfully. His family didn't have much money, and he'd learned to be careful with every dollar. "Search his bag," Kyle suggested, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Maybe he's hiding something." Before Ethan could protest, Rick grabbed his backpack and dumped the contents onto the floor. Books, notebooks, pens, and personal belongings spilled across the tile. Other students stepped around the mess, their eyes carefully averted. "Look what we have here," Damien said, picking up a faded photograph that had fallen from one of Ethan's textbooks. It showed Ethan with his arms around an elderly man, his grandfather, taken in front of a small wooden cabin. "Oh, how touching. He carries pictures of his grandpa." Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as Damien held the photo up for Kyle and Rick to see. "That's my grandfather," he said quietly, reaching out his hand. "Please give it back." "Please," Damien mocked, holding the photo higher. "I think we need to teach our friends some manners about asking nicely." He pretended to examine the photo more closely, then looked back at Ethan with a calculating gaze. "You know what? I think I'll keep this for a while. Maybe show it around, let everyone know what a mama's boy we've got here." "Give it back," Ethan said, his voice with a warning that made Kyle and Rick exchange glances. Something had shifted in Ethan's demeanor, a subtle change in posture, a different intensity in his eyes. Damien either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Or what?" he challenged, waving the photo tauntingly. "You going to tell the principal? Call your grandpa to come protect you?" Ethan took a step forward, and the air in the hallway seemed to crackle with tension. Rick's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, and Kyle straightened up from his casual lean against the wall. Something about Ethan's movement had triggered their instincts, warning them that the prey might be more dangerous than they thought. But Damien was too caught up in the game to back down now. With a deliberate motion, he tore the photo in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor around Ethan's scattered belongings. "Oops," Damien said with exaggerated innocence. "Looks like there was an accident." Ethan stared down at the torn pieces of the photo, feeling a surge of anger. The image had been taken last summer during a rare visit to his grandfather's cabin in the mountains. His grandfather had been teaching him how to chop wood, showing him the strength and discipline it took to survive in the wilderness. When Ethan looked up, Damien took an involuntary step backward. The quiet, submissive boy from the field was gone, replaced by someone with cold, focused eyes and a body that seemed coiled with suppressed energy. "You shouldn't have done that," Ethan said softly. "Yeah?" Damien recovered his bravado quickly, stepping back into Ethan's personal space. "What are you going to do about it, Blue Jacket? Cry?" Ethan bent down and began gathering his scattered belongings, his movements precise and deliberate. He collected the torn pieces of the photograph and tucked them into his pocket, then carefully repacked his backpack. The three bullies watched him with growing confusion, unsure why their victim wasn't reacting the way they expected. "That's right," Kyle said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Clean up your mess like a good little boy." Ethan stood slowly, shouldering his backpack. When he looked at Damien again, his expression was completely neutral. "I'll see you after school," he said simply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rick demanded, but Ethan was already walking away, heading toward the exit doors with steady, measured steps. Damien called after him, "Hey, we're not done here!" But Ethan didn't turn around or acknowledge the shout. He pushed through the doors and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the three bullies standing in the hallway with a nagging feeling that something had shifted in their carefully controlled world. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly for Ethan. He walked to the small apartment his family was renting, ate a quiet dinner with his mom, and completed his homework with mechanical precision. His mom asked about his day, and he gave her the usual fine response. She didn't press for details, though he saw the worry in her eyes. That evening, Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror and began practicing the self-defense moves his grandfather had taught him. He worked on his stance, his footwork, and the quick, precise strikes that could disable a larger opponent. His body remembered the techniques perfectly. The way to use his weight to his advantage, the vulnerable pressure points on the human body. His grandfather's lessons had started as a way to protect himself, but they had become something more. Ethan had discovered a sense of confidence and control he had never known before. He had learned that even a smaller person could defend themselves against a larger aggressor if they had the right knowledge and skills. The next morning at school, Ethan could feel the change in atmosphere. Word had spread about the confrontation in the hallway, and students were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be waiting for a showdown, but all of them knew something was about to happen. Damien's crew was more aggressive than usual, emboldened by their apparent victory the day before. They made a point of bumping into Ethan in the hallways, taunting him with whispered insults and threatening gestures. During lunch, they occupied his usual bench near the football field, forcing him to eat his sandwich, standing up near the garbage cans. "Looking a little nervous there, blue jacket," Kyle commented, as Ethan passed their bench on his way to throw away his trash. "You sleep okay last night? Maybe you were having nightmares about torn photographs." Ethan didn't respond, but several students at nearby tables had stopped eating to listen. The tension in the air was becoming palpable, and even some of the teachers were starting to notice. "I heard his grandpa called the school," Rick added loudly enough for half the field to hear, "wanted to complain about kids being mean to his precious grandson." This wasn't true, but truth had never mattered to bullies. The lie would spread through the school's gossip network within hours, adding another layer of humiliation to Ethan's growing reputation as a victim. "That's enough," came a voice from the other side of the field. Everyone turned to see Jessica Lee, a senior who was known for her intelligence and her willingness to stand up for others. She was walking toward their bench with a determined expression. "Stay out of this, Jessica," Damien warned, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Jessica had the kind of moral authority that could make life difficult for bullies if she chose to make an issue of their behavior. "No," Jessica said firmly, stopping directly beside Ethan. "I won't stay out of it. What you're doing is disgusting, and everyone knows it." For a moment, Ethan felt a surge of hope that someone was finally willing to confront Damien's crew. But he also knew that Jessica's intervention would only make things worse in the long run. Bullies didn't respond well to public criticism, and they would take their frustration out on him once there were no witnesses around. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly to Jessica, "but it's okay. I can handle it." Jessica looked at him with surprise and disappointment. "You don't have to handle it alone," she said. "There are people who will help if you just ask." But Ethan was already walking away, leaving Jessica standing beside Damien's bench with a frustrated expression. He knew she meant well, but she didn't understand the dynamics at play. Damien's crew wouldn't be deterred by social pressure or administrative intervention. They would only be stopped by someone willing to meet them on their own terms. The final confrontation came that afternoon as Ethan was leaving school. He deliberately stayed late in the library, hoping Damien's crew would give up waiting and go home. But as he walked through the front doors of Crestwood Academy, he saw them positioned strategically around the parking lot. Damien was leaning against a car near the exit, while Kyle and Rick had positioned themselves to block the main walkway. Other students were leaving in groups, heading toward buses and cars with the casual chatter of teenagers. A few noticed the positioning of Damien's crew and quickened their pace, instinctively avoiding what looked like a developing situation. Ethan adjusted his backpack and started walking toward the street, hoping to circle around the parking lot and avoid the confrontation. But Damien pushed off from the car and called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Blue Jacket! We need to have a chat!" Ethan kept walking, but he could hear footsteps behind him as the three bullies fell into step. The parking lot was emptying quickly as students made themselves scarce. Within minutes, the area around the school entrance was deserted, except for Ethan and his pursuers. "I said we need to have a chat," Damien repeated, his voice carrying the edge that suggested the talking phase was over. Ethan reached the sidewalk and turned to face them. The three bullies had spread out in a semicircle, cutting off his escape routes and positioning themselves for maximum intimidation. They looked confident, relaxed even, like predators who had cornered their prey. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "What do I want?" Damien scoffed, but there was no humor in it. "I want you to understand something, Seattle. Yesterday, you humiliated me in front of half the school. You walked away when I was talking to you, and you made me look like a fool." "I didn't humiliate anyone," Ethan said calmly. "I just picked up my things and left." "See, that's where you're wrong," Kyle interjected, cracking his knuckles. "When Damien's talking to you, you listen until he's finished. That's how respect works." Rick stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could smell the sweat on his clothes. "We tried to be nice," he said. "We tried to teach you the rules the easy way, but I guess you need a harsher lesson." Ethan felt the familiar calm settling over him, the same focused state he had learned from his grandfather. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and his awareness expanded to take in every detail of his surroundings. Three opponents, spread out but not professional, they were used to intimidating, not fighting. Damien was the leader, but probably the weakest physically. Kyle was tall but lanky, favoring his right side. Rick was the most dangerous, built like a tank with fists that looked like they could crush bone. "Last chance, Blue Jacket," Damien said, taking off his jacket. "Get on your knees, apologize for disrespecting me, and maybe we'll just rough you up a little. Keep acting tough, and we'll put you in the hospital." Ethan slowly shrugged off his backpack, setting it down carefully on the sidewalk. The motion was deliberate, methodical, and something about it made Kyle take a step backward. "You sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying a new tone that none of them had heard before. It wasn't fear or pleading. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. "What's that supposed to mean?" Rick demanded, but his eyes were studying Ethan, picking up on the subtle changes in his posture. Ethan straightened up, and when he looked at them again, the transformation was complete. The quiet, submissive boy they'd been tormenting was gone, replaced by someone with the dangerous calm of a trained fighter. "It means," Ethan said softly, "you picked the wrong kid." Damien charged first, throwing a clumsy punch that Ethan easily dodged. Ethan stepped inside Damien's reach and delivered a sharp elbow to his nose. As Damien stumbled backward, Ethan swept his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. Kyle and Rick rushed him simultaneously, but Ethan was ready. He sidestepped Kyle's charge, grabbed his arm, and used his momentum to flip him over his shoulder, sending him crashing to the pavement. Rick was more cautious, circling with his fists raised. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, looking at Damien's motionless form with shock. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he moved forward with fluid grace, feinting to the left before delivering a swift kick to Rick's knee. The bigger boy buckled, and Ethan followed up with a punch to the jaw that sent him crashing to the ground. The entire fight had lasted less than a minute. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, barely breathing hard, looking down at three bullies who had learned a painful lesson. Damien was groaning, his nose bleeding. Kyle was clutching his shoulder, and Rick was trying to get up, his knee throbbing. "Listen carefully," Ethan said, his voice clear and firm. "This ends now. You don't talk to me, you don't look at me, and you sure as hell don't touch me or my stuff ever again. If I hear about you bothering anyone else, I'll find you. Understand?" Rick nodded weakly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. Kyle mumbled an assent from the ground. Damien was too dazed to respond. Ethan picked up his backpack and walked away, leaving the three bullies on the sidewalk behind him. The next morning at Crestwood Academy, Ethan walked through the front doors, wearing the same blue jacket, but everything else had changed. Students stepped aside to let him pass, some with respect, others with nervous glances. Damien's crew was nowhere to be seen during first period, and by lunchtime, rumors were circulating that they'd all called in sick. Ethan ate his sandwich at his usual bench, and no one bothered him. Jessica stopped by to tell him she was proud of him for standing up for himself. When Damien, Kyle, and Rick finally returned to school 3 days later, they were noticeably subdued. Damien wore a bandage on his nose, Kyle had his arm in a sling, and Rick limped noticeably. They avoided Ethan, and their reign of terror was over. Ethan continued to wear his blue jacket and keep to himself, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence. He had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to stand up and fight back. One afternoon, Ethan was approached by a younger student who was being harassed by some older kids. Ethan listened to his story and agreed to help. He spoke to the bullies, and the younger student's problems disappeared. Word spread that Ethan Bell was someone who protected the weak. He never sought out fights, but everyone knew he was not to be trifled with. By the time graduation arrived, Ethan had earned genuine respect from his peers and a reputation as a protector. He had learned that strength could be used for good, and that standing up to bullies could make a difference. The quiet kid in the blue jacket had taught Crestwood Academy a valuable lesson, and 3 bullies had learned that picking on the wrong person could have consequences. Character count: 3903.